2 weeks, the long-range forecast had a split personality. One set of headlines said the heat was coming back. A September heat wave, temperatures climbing again after the wettest stretch of the summer. Another set said the opposite. A sudden cold snap, an early end to summer, autumn arriving ahead of schedule. Neither of those happened. What's actually forming over the UK right now is something quieter than both predictions, and in some ways more disruptive than either. A slow, heavy, thundery system that's already triggered flood alerts, and one that's forecast to sit over the country for days rather than pass through in an afternoon. To understand why this caught so many forecasts off guard, you have to look at what was actually being debated behind the scenes. The strange part isn't that the forecast changed. Forecasts change constantly, sometimes hour to hour. The strange part is how wide the gap turned out to be between the two scenarios being publicly discussed and the far less dramatic reality that's now unfolding. Nobody was talking about more of the same, but wetter. They were talking about which extreme would win, heat or cold. The actual answer was neither. The two competing headlines. Long-range forecasting doesn't produce a single answer. It produces a range of possibilities, weighted by probability. And when that range is wide, headline writers tend to pick the two most dramatic ends of it. That's exactly what happened here. On one side, some signals pointed toward a rebuild of high pressure, with warmth returning to parts of England and Wales. On the other, a cooler, more autumnal pattern looked plausible if the jet stream dipped further south than usual for this time of year. Both were legitimate readings of an uncertain signal. Neither was a confident forecast. And that distinction between a genuine possibility and an actual prediction is exactly where things went sideways in the public conversation. A range of outcomes framed as two competing weather stories, heat versus cold, made for better headlines than the far less dramatic truth sitting between them. Sustained, unsettled, rainy weather without either extreme. This is a pattern worth recognizing beyond just this 1 week. Long-range forecasts are built from ensembles, dozens of slightly different model runs, each starting from a marginally different reading of current conditions, producing a spread of possible outcomes rather than one fixed answer. When that spread is genuinely wide, the honest description is several outcomes remain plausible. When that description gets compressed into a single punchy headline, it's almost always the two most extreme members of that spread that get picked because they're the most attention-grabbing, even though the most probable outcome, statistically, often sits somewhere in the middle. What's actually happening? Here's the forecast. Met Office guidance is confirming right now, not 2 weeks out, today. A band of heavy and thundery rain is moving slowly north across England and Wales, reaching Northern Ireland and southern Scotland later in the day. Yellow warnings for thunderstorms are in force across parts of England and Wales, with flood alerts already active in northeast England. The system isn't racing through, it's moving slowly, which is precisely why it matters. A fast-moving band of heavy rain dumps its water and clears the same area within an hour or two. A slow-moving one can sit over the same towns and rivers for an extended stretch, and that's the difference between a wet afternoon and a genuine flood risk. Behind that, the outlook for the bank holiday weekend isn't settling down either. Further spells of rain are expected to move across the UK, meaning this isn't a single system passing through before things calm down. It's a pattern change. It helps to compare this to what a normal unsettled spell looks like. Most late summer wet periods in the UK involve a front moving through, clearing overnight, and leaving a day or two of drier weather before the next one arrives. A rhythm of wet, dry, wet, dry. What's forming now doesn't follow that rhythm. The rain arriving today is expected to be followed by more rain on Friday, and then more again over the bank holiday weekend, with no clear, dry break signposted in between. That absence of a reset point is part of what makes this pattern change more significant than a typical few days of showers. The technical part. In plain language, forecasters describe part of what's driving this as low pressure edging north and east. Here's what that actually means. Areas of low pressure are, essentially, zones where air is rising rather than sinking. Rising air cools as it climbs, and cooling air can't hold onto as much moisture, so that moisture condenses into cloud and eventually falls as rain. The stronger and slower moving the low pressure system, the more persistent and widespread that rain becomes. What makes this particular setup notable is where that low pressure is sitting. Rather than tracking quickly across the country and out into the North Sea, it's edging into position and staying there, which is exactly the ingredient that turns an unsettled few days into a longer wet spell. There's a second layer to this worth understanding. Warm, humid air is still in place ahead of the rain, left over from the summers. Heat. When that warm air gets lifted rapidly by the incoming system, it doesn't just produce rain. It produces the kind of instability that generates thunderstorms and locally very heavy downpours, rather than steady, predictable rainfall. Think of it as two different kinds of rain competing for the same sky. Steady frontal rain is what you'd expect from a straightforward low-pressure system, consistent, moderate, spread evenly across many hours. Thundery, convective rain is far more concentrated, short bursts of intense downpour separated by calmer spells, with totals that can vary enormously between two towns only a few miles apart. This week's setup is producing a mix of both, which is part of why the warnings cover such a broad swathe of England and Wales, rather than a narrow, predictable band. Why this counts as a genuine surprise? It's worth being precise about what actually got this wrong, because the forecast change happens constantly in meteorology and usually isn't newsworthy on its own. What's different here is the gap between the range of outcomes being discussed publicly, heat wave on one end, cold snap on the other, and the outcome that's now confirmed. Neither extreme materialized. Instead, the atmosphere settled into a pattern. That wasn't the headline candidate on either side of the debate. Sustained instability and heavy rain without the dramatic temperature swing either story promised. This happens more often than most viewers realize, and it points to something forecasters have been increasingly open about this year, a widening gap between how confident the public expects a forecast to sound and how confident forecasters can honestly be beyond about a week out. Recent Met Office research on this exact issue found a significant trust gap between traditional, physics-based forecasting and newer AI-assisted methods, with far more public confidence placed in the older approach. That gap matters here, because the further out a forecast reaches, the more it's built on probability ranges rather than firm predictions. And ranges don't always translate cleanly into a single, clean headline. What happens when the pattern breaks? Here's the part that matters beyond this week. What actually changes when a summer, long, dry, hot pattern gets replaced by a slow, heavy, thundery one. The most immediate consequence is what meteorologists sometimes call weather whiplash, the rapid swing from one extreme to a very different one, without a gentle transition in between. After a summer of extended heat and drought across large parts of England, the ground has spent months losing its ability to absorb water quickly. A slow-moving band of heavy rain landing on that kind of surface doesn't behave the way the same rainfall would on normal, absorbent soil. Instead of soaking in evenly, a significant share of it runs off rapidly, which is exactly the mechanism behind the flood alerts already in force in northeast England. That's the secondary hazard hiding inside this story. The headline, "Risk is heavy rain and thunderstorms." The hidden risk is what that rain does when it lands on ground that isn't ready to receive it. This is a version of the same pattern that showed up earlier in the summer, just reversed in direction. Extreme heat left the ground unable to absorb rain quickly. Now the very system meant to relieve that dry spell is arriving fast enough that a meaningful share of it can't be absorbed at all. It simply runs off toward the nearest river or drain instead. In effect, the drought and the flood risk are two expressions of the same underlying problem, a landscape that's been pushed toward extremes in both directions within a single season without the gradual transitions that would normally let the ground adjust. The regional picture. This isn't landing on the country evenly, and understanding where it's heaviest matters for anyone trying to plan around it. Today, the heaviest and most thundery rain is tracking across England and Wales, pushing north through the afternoon into Northern Ireland and southern Scotland. Northeast England is under existing flood alerts, and further heavy, persistent rain is expected to continue there into Friday. Scattered. Thunderstorms are also possible toward the southeast as the day develops. By Friday, the pattern shifts slightly. Bands of rain and showers move across many parts of the country, with the most persistent rain now expected towards the northeast, while Northern Ireland and southeast England have the best chance of staying comparatively dry. That's a meaningful contrast within a single 24-hour window. The same unsettled forecast label covering both the wettest and driest corners of the country at the same time. Behind all of that, the wider signal for the bank holiday weekend points to further rain moving across the UK, rather than a return to settled conditions. This isn't a one-day event with clear skies waiting on the other side of it. For anyone with plans over the long weekend, the practical takeaway isn't which single day looks best. It's that the entire period carries some level of rain risk, and outdoor plans built around finding one dry pocket may need a backup, regardless of which day is chosen. What forecasters are confident about, and what they aren't confirmed. A band of heavy and thundery rain is moving north across England and Wales. Today, with yellow thunderstorm warnings and active flood alerts already in place in northeast England. Forecast, with reasonably high confidence, further rain and showers continuing through Friday, with the northeast seeing the most persistent totals, and southeast England and Northern Ireland faring driest, followed by an unsettled bank holiday weekend, rather than a clear return to dry, settled weather. Possible, but genuinely uncertain. How this pattern evolves beyond the immediate week. The earlier speculation about a September heat wave hasn't been ruled out entirely for later in the outlook period, and neither has a cooler, more autumnal turn. But Met Office guidance is explicit that confidence in either scenario decreases significantly beyond the next week or two. That uncertainty isn't a failure of forecasting. It's an honest description of how far out a specific, reliable prediction can currently reach. Why this matters beyond the forecast itself. There's a broader pattern underneath this specific event, and it connects directly to why the "nobody predicted this" framing is fair rather than exaggerated. Britain has spent this entire summer swinging between extremes: record heat, landscape-scale drought, hundreds of wildfires, and now a slow-moving band of thundery rain landing on ground that's spent months losing its capacity to absorb water. Each swing has been more disruptive than a similar event would have been in an ordinary year, precisely because the conditions before it left less margin for error. That's the real story behind this week's forecast reversal. It's not just that two competing headlines both turned out to be wrong. It's that the actual outcome, sustained instability, heavy rain, and flooding risk on parched ground, is arguably more consequential for infrastructure, agriculture, and daily life than either the heat wave or the cold snap that dominated the public conversation beforehand. The signal to watch next. Rather than closing on a general summary, here's the specific thing worth tracking over. The next several days, how far south and east the heaviest, most persistent rainfall bands push. If the wettest totals stay concentrated in the north and northeast, as current guidance suggests, the drought-stressed south and east of England may see only partial relief from months of water deficit, meaning restrictions and dry ground risk there could persist, even as flooding dominates headlines further north. If the rain bands shift further south over the coming days, that calculation changes, and the story becomes less about flooding in one region and drought in another, and more about which parts of the country get meaningful drought relief at all before autumn sets in. That's the number to watch, not the temperature and not which headline turns out to be right. It's where the rain actually falls.